afternoon. We're very lucky to have Alison Taylor. Alison is currently the Director for Business for Social Responsibility, also BSR, which is a global nonprofit organization. Alison directs the Energy and Extractives division and co-leads the sustainability management sector of BSR as well. Prior to this, Alison was the senior managing director of Control Risks, big title, and also has experience working at Transparency International, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and IHS Global Insight. Experience in strategic intelligence, risk consulting, due diligence, internal investigations, enterprise risk management, and ethics and compliance. Alison has a master's in international relations from the University of Chicago, a master's in organizational psych from Columbia, and a BA in modern history from Balliol College at Oxford. Let's give Alison a nice round of welcome.
Hi everybody, thanks very much for coming. The title of my talk today, as you can see, is Sustainability and the Future of Business Ethics, which is a pretty big, grandiose, vague title. So I'm going to focus very much on the practical questions around this. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just talking about my organization, because hopefully that will explain to some degree why I think I'm qualified to tackle these big, grandiose topics. And then I have two sections really looking at or trying to describe how I think companies, so private sector companies, are treating business ethics questions today. And I think you can look at the question. It's very interesting to look at how the organization is thinking about the question and what specifically that means in terms of departments and roles. So as an aside, when I was studying international relations a very long time ago, I think I would have been very interested in a lot of the issues and potential careers in this space, but I had no idea they existed. So one of the things I'm going to be talking about is how companies think about ethical questions, and that might raise some questions for you about kind of jobs and careers in this entire space. So I'm going to talk about that for a little while. Then I'm going to talk about some of the current frameworks that come out of the UN and the OECD, helping to try and kind of describe and frame how companies should think about ethical questions. And then I'm going to spend the rest of the talk, probably most of the talk, covering 5 trends and where I think those are going to go in future, and why I think the future of business ethics, or business ethics, is just going to become a higher and higher priority, and that sustainability is a massively growing field. So that's a lot to cover. There'll be a lot of time for questions at the end, but if I've really lost you and you have no idea what I'm talking about and want to clarify or challenge me, feel free to ask while I'm going along. So BSR is a sustainability non-profit organization. So let me start by pulling up our mission statement. And our mission statement, to some degree, works as a definition of sustainability. I think sustainability is one of those terms. People don't really know what it means. It's very often associated with protection of the environment. It's a synonym with CSR. We prefer at BSR to use sustainability because CSR has a sort of philanthropic PR angle that we don't really like. But our mission statement is to work with business to create a just and sustainable world. And we work with a lot of very large multinational companies. So we're a global nonprofit business network. We do consulting, we do grant-funded research, and we're very big on collaboration to drive systemic change. We've got about 120 employees, 8 offices around the world, and 250 member companies. So as you can see from this list, we work with some of the biggest multinationals in the world. If you want to understand who our client base is and who we're working with, here's not everybody, but a partial list. So we're working with big business to tackle ethics and sustainability questions. I think it's important to note that we are hugely non-confrontational. So our philosophy is to work with business wherever they may be. And I think there are, rightly, often a lot of charges of hypocrisy in how business tackles ethics and social responsibility questions. It is not our role as an organisation to call out that hypocrisy. There are many advocacy organisations and NGOs, Human Rights Watch, Greenpeace, etc., whose role is to do that. We certainly think there's a space there for those organisations as part of the debate. But our role is more to work with companies to try and move the needle, but to move them from where they are to where they would want to be. So we don't have a problem, for example, working with the oil and gas sector, working with the tobacco sector. We debate these questions a lot internally. I think they're very interesting debates. But in general, if somebody wants to be a member, we will let them be a member and we'll try and work with them. So I think that's interesting, and I'm happy to answer questions on it later as we get through the talk. So the state of play in business ethics today, I think, is really summarized by this picture of Marlon Brando in the bottom right. We could have a conversation about what business ethics are. I think that's a massive philosophical question. It's not one I'm really qualified to answer, but the purpose of business and what the purpose of a company really is a very, very interesting question. And I think since at least the 40s or 50s, the answer to that has been driven by this sort of Milton Friedman free market capitalist idea that the purpose of a company is to make as much money as possible for shareholders. It's pretty easy to beat up on Milton Friedman. If you actually look at this quote here, this line is very interesting. While conforming to the basic rules of society, both embodied in law and in ethical custom, that immediately raises a ton of questions about how business should be operating. And elsewhere, Milton Friedman also said, if a company is operating in a community, it may be sensible and wise to make investments into that community. So you can make the argument that Milton Friedman's views are perfectly compatible with a sustainable approach to business, particularly if you take a longer term view rather than a short term quarterly reporting view. But anyway, this sort of simplified concept, the idea of survival of the fittest, it's just business. Business ethics is an oxymoron, arguably, and I think this is still the dominant view today. And we can talk about the kind of pressures that view's under, but if you watched the Trump-Clinton debate on Monday night, you saw Trump making some version of these arguments. It was fine that I made loads of money from the housing market collapse because that's just business. It's very interesting to watch him that he kind of reverts to these arguments about what I am doing is ethically neutral because it's just a question of business. You can see how hopefully untenable that position will be for Trump, but I think once you kind of start to think about how businesses operate and justify what they're doing, there is throughout the private sector still at the moment this idea that maximizing value for shareholders is ethically neutral. It doesn't have an ethical dimension. And yes, if we can do something else, that's fine. But beyond legal compliance, business does not have ethical responsibilities. And you can also see that because in most large multinationals, ethics and compliance is the name of a department. So basically what that's saying is it's drawing an equivalence between legal compliance and business ethics. And it's saying, as long as we adhere to the law, we don't have wider ethical responsibilities. The fact that the ownership of business ethics sits with a bunch of compliance officers and lawyers is in itself a very, very interesting question. And I think I'm going to argue, and I suspect many of you would agree with me, but that this is no longer a sustainable position. And that businesses need to, in some way, address wider ethical, social, environmental, and governance questions. The problem is that once you start to think about how they might do that, the situation gets a lot more complicated. So I think one of the reasons this view that's outlined on this slide has dominated is that it's simple. It gives companies a way to make decisions, it's profit, it's quarterly reporting. And once you start to say, well, actually, what is the role of business and what's the role of the public sector, everything starts to get muddy and complicated. But I think really, given the state of the world, we need to kind of tackle these questions. I'm going to come back to the themes on this slide in a lot more detail later, so this is just to kind of skip through them briefly at the moment. I would say, unarguably, that the relationship between business and society is changing, and this dominant paradigm is coming under more intense pressure, arguably, than ever before. So we've got mounting economic, social, political, environmental challenges, climate change, income inequality, huge amount of political disruption, et cetera, just over the migrant labor, terrorism, etc. So are the challenges worse than they've ever been before? I don't know. I think you can make an argument that they are. We've certainly got collapsing public trust in business. Newspapers love to talk about millennials and what you need to do to motivate millennials and keep millennials in your company. And there's a huge body of research that behaving more responsibly and having a more responsible ethical culture is the way to keep fabled millennials engaged. So public collapsing trust in business, also in government as an aside. But there are horrifying statistics. It's really at an all-time low, and I think there are very good reasons for that. Increased expectations on corporate transparency and ethics. I think, again, that's fairly obvious. I think this is connected to the next box over, which is what we might call hyper-transparency, or the rise of the internet has meant that it's very, very difficult at this point for a company to reliably control its public profile and its reputation. Stories can go viral. Things that would have been local disputes can be global issues very, very quickly. If we think about Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, we think about what happened in Qatar. These issues are not issues that a company can manage and manipulate through PR anymore because of what's happened with IT, effectively. And then there's a growing role of business in sustainability issues. I think COP21, the climate change negotiations there, a recognition that business needed to be at the table and have a say really for the first time. And then increasing investor interest in what investors call ESG, so that's environmental, social, and governance issues. And this idea that investors want to measure ESG responsibility is kind of gaining momentum. I and many other people would make the argument that good ESG management is actually just good management, but that's a conversation we can get into later. But so unarguably, these pressures on companies are increasing, and companies are feeling the pressure and feeling that they have to respond. We can certainly make the argument that there's a need for a more collaborative, inclusive, and deeper engagement with society. The question is really how to do that. So this is a diagram that sort of describes how companies today are treating business and ethical questions. I've talked about ethics and compliance already as a department, and the department that owns ethical questions. But this is the area where you would expect to see kind of controls and processes around areas where there is already a legal framework. So corporate governance, corruption is a huge one, sanctions, money laundering. And the role of this department tends to be quite technical and quite process-driven. So this will be lawyers on the whole, or accountants who are putting in place processes to help companies meet legal requirements, and they also have ownership of these ethical questions. But clearly, meeting legal requirements is only going to kind of get you so far. And so the other department in companies that tackles ethical questions, though does not actually tend to frame them in ethical terms, is sustainability. And it can be called CSR, it can be called corporate responsibility, it's sometimes called corporate citizenship. But there is increasingly a team that covers issues that are not yet law, but are ethical questions. So you can also think of this as a trajectory. So when something starts to be of public concern and starts to be an issue that companies feel they need to engage and tackle on, it tends to sit in sustainability. Once the issue starts to get into policy and law, it tends to move into ethics and compliance. So you can think about corruption in this sense. Now, corruption used to be tax deductible in Germany in the late 90s. It's been illegal in the US for a long time by the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but nobody really enforced that act. But as the legal regime around corruption got tighter, it became more of an ethics and compliance question. And there's now a very established kind of approach for how companies treat compliance, treat anti-corruption compliance. Whereas something like carbon emissions or human rights or labor rights or diversity, women's empowerment, inclusive economies, biodiversity, stakeholder engagement, these kind of, they're usually regarded as softer, fluffier concepts. And the idea is not that there's no laws around this, but there is an accepted legal framework, and how companies should behave is not set by the legal framework. Those issues tend to sit over here. So what you have at the moment is a sustainability department covering the softer emerging issues of public concern, and then once it becomes a legal issue, it sits in ethics and compliance. And what this results in is a kind of lack of alignment and messaging and thinking around ethical questions like what's the purpose of a company. And I think it's always very interesting when you're looking at a company to see how they treat these respective issues. And some companies are very, very strong on compliance. Oil and gas and mining is an obvious one. They come out of sort of safety and security. Some companies are much, much kind of stronger over here, and that's an expression of culture, an expression of the industry that they're in quite a lot. So I think the open question for the future is if these ideas were integrated, or if companies took a more integrated approach to business ethics, what exactly would that look like, and how would the organization manage it? So for the next two slides, I'm going to talk about the challenges on this side in doing that, and then the challenges on that side, and then we'll move on. So on the compliance side, and I worked in ethics and anti-corruption compliance and investigations for a long time, what you've seen, mainly in response to concern about anti-corruption, is that there's now a framework about what good corporate compliance looks like. And it's basically you have policies, you have training, you have tone at the top, you have due diligence. There's a fairly established at this point international consensus about what a good compliance program looks like. The problem is that those programs really aren't working very well. So if you think about the financial crisis, the issue was that the banks involved in the financial crisis, it wasn't that there weren't enough compliance officers and lawyers and compliance programs. It was that the bankers in those scenarios were able to make decisions that were not caught by those compliance processes. We can think about Wells Fargo, we can think about Volkswagen, we can think about Petrobras. We don't need to look very far to see that there are many companies with tons of lawyers and tons of compliance officers that are still, causing massive and horrifying ethical violations. So there's become this increasing kind of focus as a result on culture, an organizational culture, and what that really would look like and how to measure it. And so what compliance teams are trying to tackle it at the moment is how you measure organizational culture and how you understand it. There's a lot of kind of thinking that, these people just broke the law because they were rogue employees. There was a rogue employee that got up one morning and just decided to break the law. And you saw that the Wells Fargo CEO actually kind of made that argument. There were loads of junior people in this department that just all decided to break the law. I mean, this is not a credible argument, and I think people are becoming increasingly skeptical about these arguments. So there's a lot of pressure on compliance officers to sort of grapple more broadly with ethical questions and ethical culture and extend their remit. But nobody at the moment is quite sure what to do about that, because culture is incredibly difficult to manage. There's not a lot of money in it for consultants and lawyers and accountants, so everyone would rather stick with kind of rolling out these very expensive processes. But clearly, if we're going to really think about business ethics, we need to think about culture and how people are really behaving in the organization, and I think power relationships and what those look like. So what tends to happen is that, in the banking crisis, senior traders are totally able to override compliance officers who tend to be badly paid and don't have much credibility. So these raw exercises of power are one example of how culture can go wrong, and these things kind of really need to be tackled. So there's a lot of focus on culture. There's a lot of focus on how to measure and develop that. Looking at kind of sales incentives, looking at how you account for staff accountability, a lot around kind of time pressure and urgency, and back to corporate reporting. There was a recent letter or statement by a bunch of investors, including Jamie Dimon, Warren Buffett, sort of saying that quarterly reporting's broken and we need to take this longer term view, and I would tend to agree with that. So things are kind of moving here. People are calling more for transparency. And then the other point I'd make that's putting compliance officers under enormous pressure is that there's this new whistleblowing paradigm that's focused on massive data leaks. So Edward Snowden really kicked this off, but there's been the Panama Papers. I think there'll be a lot more. So again, this idea companies can't control their reputations. At any minute, an insider employee might leak loads of data and reveal what's really going on. So companies are really feeling like they have to behave as if everything they do is public, even if it isn't for the moment. So that's what the world looks like from the ethics and compliance officer's perspective. From the sustainability manager's perspective, remember the left hand of the diagram I presented earlier, sustainability people, the cliche is that they're sort of hippies, they're very worthy, they want to make business do good. If you talk to lots of people in mainstream business, they'll sort of roll their eyes when corporate sustainability comes up. This is it's a very interesting skill set, it's a very interesting job, and I think the plethora of jargon in the field, there's a lot of talk about purpose and shared value and circular economy and net positive. And the reason that you see that, and it's so kind of difficult to nail down these concepts, is that sustainability teams, I think, are really grappling with areas that are just becoming public concerns, just becoming ethical issues, but before they get codified into law. So that accounts for the sort of slightly chaotic, it's quite difficult to define what sustainability is, and it's a little bit of a slippery concept, but that's due to the way it's treated and the way it's understood in companies. But sustainability teams often lack organizational budget and influence. They're put in a variety of different places. Sometimes they report into HR, sometimes PR, sometimes legal, sometimes government affairs. There's a whole debate in sustainability about the business case for sustainability. People love to talk about the business case for sustainability. If you're more responsible, you'll make more money in the end. And people kind of tie themselves up in knots trying to prove that sustainable business is actually more profitable, and there's quite a lot of evidence, actually, that for companies that behave responsibly, it does have financial benefits. But I think that's not always the case. And I think sustainability teams are fundamentally making normative arguments that you should do this because it's the right thing to do. But then they also need to convince the more commercial people. So there's a very sort of muddy, do we need a business case? Do we not need a business case? Is it best to talk about risk? But really we want to be talking about opportunity and doing the right thing and being inspiring. And there's a sort of, if you start to look at the arguments that sustainability people make, you get into this slightly muddy space about, is there a business case? Is there not a business case? There's then a ton of sustainability reporting frameworks. They're pretty complicated. They're pretty confusing. We have seen a lot of focus in the last decade on human rights and how corporations should take human rights as their starting point. that's gaining a lot of traction. But human rights people make the argument that companies should measure not the risk of human rights violations to their business, but the impacts on the people around them that business makes. And it's very, very difficult, I think, in practice for companies that have budgets and departments and profit targets to talk about impacts and to prioritize impacts on somebody that may be powerless and may not be going to buy their product. So human rights is still a very kind of complicated area. We've got environmental and investor pressure around climate. I think you can argue that's reaching a tipping point. I have a lot of meetings with investors and a lot of meetings with oil and gas companies, and the conversation tends to be about, well, when are we going to hit the tipping point? When is renewables going to take off? When is everyone going to pull out? And I think there's increasingly an idea that there will be that tipping point, but everyone's kind of waiting to see what everyone else will do. My tip for you, if you're interested to know when that tipping point is, I think looking at what insurance companies are doing is extremely interesting. So, obviously in insurance, if you are known to be a drunk driver, you pay higher premiums. So there's an emerging argument that if you pollute environmentally or cause social damage, you should pay higher premiums. And I think that argument will get traction. So looking at what insurers are doing rather than banks, if you want to know where the environmental debate is, I think is a good tip. Charges of greenwashing are still kind of prevalent here as well. Very interesting article on H&M earlier this year about, can it really credibly get into clothing recycling at the same time as churning out masses of clothes every day, And so that sort of conversation epitomizes the complexity of how you might try and kind of understand and delineate and provide advice on how the private sector should behave here. And then, finally, there's an argument that sustainability teams should be integrated into the wider business, that actually the problem with ethics and the problem with sustainability is that we're pulling them out and we're treating them as departments and cost centers. And surely what we need is for the whole organization to prioritize ethics and sustainability and build that into how it runs things. And that sounds great. I tend to agree with it. Extremely difficult to make it work in practice. So that's kind of where we are. We've got ethics, we've got sustainability, and we've got a very wide range of responses to business ethics questions. I'm going to spend a few minutes really, really briefly, because there are some frameworks that are intended to be comprehensive and provide a way forward for business on ethics. I'm just going to describe them just in case you're wondering why I missed them out, and then we're going to kind of move on to talking about the future. So one is the UN Global Compact. This was established by the UN in 2000. It's got 10 principles. You can see them here. It's pretty broad-based. I think there are about, 1,000 companies, though, have signed up to these principles. So companies sign up to these principles, and then they have to report on them every year. They have to provide some funding to the UN Global Compact. So this is one of the attempts to kind of provide a sort of operating framework for companies about what ethics and sustainability looks like. But not legally binding. There's no legal obligation on companies to do this. But these are things that a lot of companies do and report on, and they like the alignment, and they like sort of the view of the UN, but arguably could have a lot more traction. 8,000 companies is actually not that much when you think about it. The OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises are actually earlier. They came out in 1976, but have had multiple revisions. These are a little bit more kind of specific in terms of business. So it covers these 10 areas. So taxation and competition, a little bit more kind of technical business issues than the UN Global Compact. And then there's this, again, not legally binding. I mean, some things are legally binding like anti-corruption laws, but the principles themselves are not. And countries, OECD countries, have national contact points, and you can take disputes there and kind of get them resolved. These have not been used as much as people would like. There was a little bit of momentum. There are about 14 countries where there's never been a complaint at all. So I think questions about the kind of visibility and effectiveness here. But if after 2011, when the UN Guiding Principles were introduced, this got a little bit more momentum. So the UN Guiding Principles, John Ruggie developed these. This was, I think it's fair to say, an incredible achievement. There have been many, many, many attempts to describe a human rights framework that accurately kind of accounted for what everybody should be doing. They'd collapsed, they'd failed. This is an extremely difficult thing to do. And what John Ruggie was able to do through a lot of consultation was to say it is the state's duty, so the governance duty, to protect human rights. It is the corporate's responsibility to respect human rights, and then states and companies have to provide access to remedy. So somewhere you can raise your grievances and get them resolved. So this is incredibly coherent. It makes sense, and it provides a way forward. So I think this is, and has resulted in revisions to the OECD guidelines. But this is a very, very interesting one. I think it's still getting momentum, and there are increasingly established ways that corporations kind of tackle this thing in the middle, and there's a whole thing about, are you directly caused? Are you directly causing the human rights impact? Are you contributing, or are you linked? And I can answer some questions on that later. But I think this has been a sort of huge step forward in kind of coherence and thinking about sustainability and ethical questions via the lens of human rights. And then from the sublime to the arguably ridiculous, this is not the opinion of BSR, but my opinion, the Sustainable Development Goals, which came out last year. So this is a follow-up to the Millennial Development Goals, 17 goals. I mean, another attempt to kind of provide a framework again for how states and business should work together to make the world better. If you actually look at them, there is a wild difference in kind of targets and specificity. I mean, they go into we should eliminate energy subsidies. Some of them are arguably very vague and fluffy. I think this is a consequence of how many stakeholders are involved in their development, but they are, if you sort of sit and read them carefully, from a business perspective and trying to figure out what you should do with them, it's pretty challenging. And I think certainly people I've spoken to in the mining and oil and gas sector, they would say, we already had a problem with this, that everybody went off and kind of got into these education and health projects, and we don't know how to do this, and we created all these dependencies. And the last thing we want is this kind of idea that businesses should be in this space. So I think there's certainly an idea that you should look at what you do and then look at how you contribute, rather than thinking you need to tick all of these 17 boxes. So that's what we've got at the moment. We've got the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Guiding Principles, and this framework. So this is kind of where the world is today in thinking about ethical questions and providing a way for business to go forward. I'm now going to just spend the last section of this talk talking about the future and why I think everything I've described already is going to gain so much more momentum, and why and the areas I think we're going to see this gain momentum, and what we might expect to see kind of next. So the first area I've talked about it a little bit already is hypertransparency, the hyperconnectivity revolution. Obviously, talking about the effects of the internet is not hugely original. This is a very long-term trend. Exponential increase in connectivity, blah, blah, blah. But I think there have been a number of, so this is a sort of broad brush trend, and all we can say when we're looking at it is that there will be incidents, and I think there have been things that have happened in 2016 where we can say definitively that the landscape has changed. And I think the Panama Papers is certainly one of those things. I think we could have a conversation about the post-truth environment in the media and what that means, but very kind of much more fragmented media than there ever was before, fragmented public debate. You can't trust your Twitter and Facebook feed anymore because it's just telling you what you want to hear, etc. but this kind of rise of hyper-transparency as a focus for civil society it is really, really a huge thing. I was in Myanmar earlier this year, working on a sort of a kind of sensitive human rights project, and what was happening there were that all these sort of civil society groups were kind of coming up, and it was really fluid, and they were all on Facebook, and you couldn't figure out who was who. But they were framing their very local grievances using the language of global human rights and global environmental justice. They knew what they needed to say to get global media attention, and they were being picked up by global NGOs. So their very, very localized disputes around gas pipelines were being picked up and adopted by global civil society human rights organizations. And you see this over and over again. So environmental justice advocates in Latin America around a mining site, that will be picked up by Human Rights Watch or Global Witness or Greenpeace and turned into a global theme. So you can't control your local disputes, you can't control your local problems anymore. And I think I would argue that signifies a fundamental shift in the terms and conduct of stakeholder engagement, which is another jargony sustainability term I've used a couple of times in this presentation, but your stakeholders are your employees, your supply chain, the communities, governments, NGOs, investors. So I think there is this idea that businesses needs to engage with all its stakeholders, not just its shareholders, in a transparent, timely and accountable way, because you don't really have any choice. And technology is helping here. There are a lot of kind of new apps where factory workers can kind of take photos and give feedback about what's really going on in that factory. But this is not primarily a technological issue. This is an issue where you see the connection more between global and local issues, and everything's happening in real time. So that's something that I think will continue to increase, and arguably will force companies or encourage companies to have a very different relationship with and response to their stakeholders. The second trend I'm going to talk about, I'm calling the rise of the middle class and individual empowerment. So the middle class, and we can have a debate about how you define the middle class, but particularly in the global south has increased enormously. And with that, there has been a huge increase. This is very closely connected to the previous trend, this focus on individual rights and individual expectations. So the middle class will, it's argued, increase from 1.8 billion in 2009 to 5 billion in 2030. 90% of the world will be able to read by then. And with that comes expectations for what opportunities should be provided to your children in terms of health and education, and economic opportunity. And I think it's sort of really fascinating. You've seen these populations that while the economy was growing, were doing fine. But as the economy has slowed and governments are not able to meet the expectations of these citizens, there are all these kind of crises, and these crises tend to be focused around corruption and human rights again. If you think about Brazil and China and India and Turkey and Malaysia and Indonesia, and there's a long, long, long list of countries, there are protests and arguments that are basically middle-class people holding their governments to account for corruption. And again, I think this is only going to increase, and it's tied to what I was saying before about how these local problems have now increasingly this sort of language of human rights and empowerment and environmental justice. So that, connected with the crisis of trust in government and business and the potential for anger and disruption, are also going to force companies to act. We're not quite sure how, but I think it's pretty certain they're going to have to act, and we may yet see a lot more political turmoil in the meantime as well. All right, so the next one I'm calling demographics and the automation of work. So what we have here is a combination of rapidly aging global population, so everyone's getting older. Population growth is now going to slow. There's going to be loads of old people that need to be looked after. Decline in available workers, huge need for elderly care. And then at the same time, you've got this automation trend, which is meaning that there are arguably far less workers needed. So there's a lot of these kind of dire predictions about how automation means we're not going to need any workers, all these jobs are going to be eliminated. A lot of them are blue-collar male workers, which maybe accounts for some of the stuff that's going on in the US at the moment. But the confluence of these two trends, I think, is really, really fascinating, and it's really hard to say how this will play out. So we will see, arguably, reduced employment at the same time as a massively increased need for social services. And again, I think we can say this will cause intense pressure on both businesses and governments to provide equitable value. And if companies are not paying their taxes, and some of them aren't paying their taxes, but they can't say that they're benefiting society through employment or paying taxes, the question is, what should they be doing? And what should governments be doing? And I think these are huge and as yet unanswered questions. And one of the depressing things about the world today is how few politicians are even, well, we're nowhere, are we, in discussing these issues, which is a little scary. Trend number 4, I will call the primacy of climate change. I've talked already about insurance and investors. I think the thing to watch here is the way that climate change impacts are increasingly being tied to the human rights agenda. So the Philippines Human Rights Commission, I believe it is, has just done this investigation and called out 50 companies that it says are polluting and causing damage in its country. They're like Chevron and so on, the big kind of oil and gas companies. So it said these 50 companies in Indonesia are violating human rights by their environmental behavior. And there are kind of investigations and lawsuits starting here. We can also think about ExxonMobil here. Now, from a legal liability perspective, that is an incredibly difficult argument to make. It's incredibly difficult to say, well, Exxon caused this damage versus everything else. And so legal accountability is a real challenge. But if you think about public perception, if you think about the countries that are likely to be most affected by climate change, they can make a domestic decision and exclude investors if they want. So the increasing kind of confluence of human rights and climate issues, I think, is really, really fascinating. In the short term, I'd expect to see a lot of focus on water and water scarcity. I lived part of the time in the Catskills, and there was a very huge kind of local political movement there to stop companies connected to Nestle taking over the local water supply. So these kind of disputes around water, I mean, Sao Paulo is another kind of example. Disputes around water are something I would certainly watch in the next 15 or 20 years. There's a statistic here that 2 billion people will be living in countries or regions with absolute water scarcity by 2025. That's a staggering figure. And if you look at conflict maps in the Middle East, for example, there's actually quite a high correlation with water scarcity and conflict. So we can see the potential for a lot more conflict. This will obviously impact migration patterns. Europe's having a huge problem with that at the moment. Arguably, everybody is. So water is a strategic business issue. Climate change is a human rights issue. I think definitely coming up the agenda, and impact measurement, mediation, reporting on this will be necessary. I think there's a strong argument they won't be sufficient. The final one of my 5 trends I'm going to call regulation and responsibility in the supply chain. So what goes on in your supply chain? There's no or not much of a legal regime around this. I think companies have in general tried to say, well, the supply chain is not our responsibility. We can control our own operations. But as supply chains have globalized and have become increasingly complex, there is increased visibility over horrible working conditions, environmental degradation. Obviously, we have Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, migrant workers in the Middle East, etc. So what happens here is that there'll be an incident, there'll be a horrible disaster, and the public will kind of focus on that particular issue, and then some of the companies will move there. and start to kind of design more approaches. And this is another area I'd expect this all to get momentum. And maybe ultimately there'll be a regulatory idea of what good practice in supply chain oversight kind of looks like. And it's interesting to watch the supply chain space at the moment because we've started to see nascent regulation here, the UK Modern Slavery Act, but you will tend to see kind of how change happens is that the public will get really upset. A few companies will move and make innovative kind of policies and statements, and then the floor will move. The bottom of behaviour will move, and then other companies will have to catch up, and then ultimately you get to policy and regulation. So supply chain, labour trafficking, slavery, human rights is another kind of really hot area to kind of watch how business ethics questions are evolving. So that's about it from me. I hope I've kind of described where ethics in business is and where it might go. I would say it's unarguable that pressure on business to address ethical questions is going to increase, arguably dramatically. The discourse of CSR and sustainability has been separate from ethics in companies so far. There's ethics and compliance and the sustainability, but I think in order to address these questions, those two departments, two issues, two conversations are going to have to come together. Ethics and compliance teams have expanded power, responsibility, and liability. So what we might see in future is really summarized here. Increasing coalescence around human rights, transparency, and environmental justice as big themes. More collaboration for systemic change. I haven't talked about this too much, but business, society, and government having to get together to tackle things like climate change and human rights abuses because no one company or government can do that on its own. Lots more focus on culture and behaviour and how organisations really act. And I think then greater alignment between how the business sets strategy and how the oversight functions work. And then finally, more structured thinking about stakeholder relationships and how you measure and evaluate stakeholder trust. So I hope that wasn't too overwhelming. We have a bit of time for questions if you have any, but otherwise, thank you for listening. Hi.
A question about compliance and looking at maybe other areas in which I guess the field of business ethics can look to in propelling them. So maybe like comparing it to something like IR, where you look at compliance, international treaties or trades. A lot of it has to do with perhaps reputation, or I think there's a lot of scholars looking at reputation matters more than perhaps even like economic sanctions or things like that.
Yeah.
So do you think there's a corollary there perhaps where what happens in the public sphere, where governments are very concerned about how they look in the international space, could that then perhaps transport to the private sector where companies will eventually develop a almost commodification of morality where they will be more concerned about how they look, and that will then, I guess, serve as a better cohesive force than perhaps increased regulation, this idea of, what were the words you used, the tone from the top, I guess, developing more as time goes on, is this almost like a time game?
There's a lot in that question. I think reputational risk is a really, really interesting question. There's a couple of very good books about it. And reputational risk is one of the things that sustainability and ethics people use as part of the business case. You lose your reputation, your stock price plunges, you cannot control your reputation, so you'd better do the right thing. And I think there is to some degree a quantification of reputational risk. I think one of the problems is that risk, and particularly things that are low likelihood and high impact, are things that are not dealt with very well in companies because risk-taking is actually rewarded. People tend to think about preventative risk, like how do we prevent fraud? They don't think about risk when it's more of a kind of strategic question. So I think there's a lot of problems with how, and risk is something I haven't really touched on, but is another huge topic. How companies think about and account for risk is a really, really interesting question. and kind of gets back to this ethics and compliance thing. There was a really interesting piece of research recently that found that companies that had a lot of senior management that were in the Ashley Madison database, so cheating on their wives and husbands, were more likely, so people with a lot of these Ashley Madison people in the organization were more likely to cheat and have to do financial kind of redisclosures and so on, but they were also more creative and innovative. And I think that's one problem for compliance officers trying to kind of measure and manage culture, is that a lot of the time you're being told, well, obey the laws, but also take risks, be innovative, be positive, provide an upside. So I think reputational risk is about the best business case argument there is, but it doesn't mean necessarily that it's not challenging and being managed very well yet.
Building off the back of that, I think about it as like two ends of the spectrum, where you have companies like Deutsche Bank, say, which are now a complete mess. They've slapped fines because they did things which were completely illegal. But then you've got companies which are maybe morally questionable. They're not doing anything illegal, but there are other companies in that sector which differentiate from them and do things more ethically. A brilliant example would be like the Body Shop in the UK. Mm-hmm. Which is completely like sustainable and doesn't use any animal testing, etc. But then right across the street from it, you'll have like another pharmacy which will sell the same kind of product, but it has been tested on animals, etc. Do you think, going back to the Friedman idea of it's a free market, people can choose, that you should just put the power in the hands of the consumer and just say, look, there are two companies here, one's doing it one way, one's doing it the other way, you decide?
Yes, I do. I think where it gets complicated is the consumer going to pay more for an organic product or a sustainably manufactured piece of fashion? So that's one area it gets complicated. The other area is all these businesses are still trying to grow. Can you grow sustainably? Arguably, there's a crisis of overproduction. How much stuff do we really need? That's where you start to get into these very philosophical questions about what are business ethics anyway. So I think, great question. I think that if you take the kind of reputational consequences and the idea of transparency and that it's more difficult to say you didn't know, we certainly see a lot of momentum. I think where it becomes an economic decision is arguably where the rubber hits the road and where things get complicated. Hi.
Hi. I was wondering what your opinion on how this translates to universities as entities somewhat not quite in the business realm, but not quite like they are. They have a culture, they have some sort of responsibility that's touched on at some points, but are they capable of being apolitical, and should they be when it comes to their finances and when it comes to the issues that they promote for their students?
Wow. There's one answer there that is about there's one question there that's, do universities have a role to play in kind of driving the systemic change? Absolutely. Key stakeholder for business, key area where thinking moves along. Outside the business world, not kind of non-profit, etc. So universities and thinking and academic research has a huge role to play in kind of moving all these things along, and there are tons of examples. But your other more interesting question is about the role of universities in funding themselves. I mean, it's very common to criticize NYU, both for its massive portfolio of property in the city, but also there was a huge investigation about what it was doing in Abu Dhabi and Shanghai and where the funding came from and so on. And there's a whole question about for-profit universities and MOOCs and so on. So, universities are also part of the system and I think have to account for themselves as well. So perhaps a rather simplistic answer would be I would expect prospective students to become increasingly concerned with these issues and the role of those universities, both kind of financially and in driving change in the wider system.
I think this connects to the two questions of students asking universities to divest from South Africa, from particular countries and different sectors, but the students really pushing the universities to have more of a social conscience. versus the private market where I can decide where to spend my money and whether I want something sustainable or organic. I mean, is that are universities then a microcosm for the private market in some way, or?
On the divestment thing, they're leading. There's a lot about divestment, but actually, I mean, with some exceptions, there's the Norwegian, Parastatal, AXA, I'm thinking. So there are a few big investors that have said we're divesting. Most mainstream banks still want the opportunity to be in coal in India and China for the moment till the market moves, and they'll use their kind of private due diligence on the side. But this would be the divestment movement combined with insurance is what I kind of look for. But certainly we can see sort of, you can have a conversation about divestment, but leading positions from the universities, which partly reflects a generational shift, which arguably when current students are my age and doing these kind of jobs will lead to a very, very different paradigm. I think there's no question that these environmental issues and divestment are about to reach a tipping point. It's just a question of whether it's 5, 10, 15 years. And I think to some degree that will be driven, sadly, by what happens in the world and the actual real-time impacts of climate change.
Hello, I'm Darrell. I'm an
Hi.
80-year-old who's trying to keep his mind going. And this is, because of your accent, this is a fun question. When the last time you've been to London, have you eaten food that's prepared by 3D printers?
I have not eaten that I know of.
They say it's now coming. It's now done in London. So I thought maybe you might have done it.
Well, how
And the implication of that.
I thought you were going to ask about Brexit.
The implication of that is some of your ideas. For example, if 3D printing really can be economically feasible to produce food, we won't have to put so much water into cows that we eat our beef from. So the tremendous water broth. I mean, just all gets in around. The other thing that I'd really like to hear something from you on seriously is work. I'm beginning to hear it here, but the last 5 or 6 years in my readings, casual, I admit, not academically powerful, is work is gone. In a few more years, 10, 15, 20 years, very few of us will have to work 40-hour weeks anymore.
Yeah, but people were saying that in the 30s, and everyone's working harder than ever. I think there's underemployed and overemployed
But I
at
swear,
the
I'm
moment.
now reading that not only in funny old magazines like Wired and Science,
Mhm.
but New York Times, Forbes. They're raising the issue, and I hear them starting to talk about it here.
Yes,
So, how much do you come across that?
huge. We have a report, it's on our website, called it's about automation and the future of work. Yeah, I think it ties to the slide about demographics and
Yeah.
automation and the future of work. What's really concerning is how little the policy space and governments seem to be in
Because
even
believe me,
anywhere on
the
tackling these
government and
issues.
society and businesses are going to figure out how to pay for them.
Well, we hope.
It's going to be a big issue.
It is already a big issue and will
people try to
become more of
cheat
a
the most
one.
and trying to
Well,
get
I
out of paying
think
their fair share.
what is social security and what's the responsibility of business and government? I mean, healthcare is another example where it's getting too expensive, arguably. So then what do we expect from business and government in future? I don't have the answers. I'm just raising the questions that these will be very significant debates with the potential for very significant chaos
I did hear
before
you
they're
say
resolved.
Really starting in big chunks of your thinking now is working on that particular issue.
Yes.
Thank you.
There's a whole movement in the ILO around good jobs. So this idea of good jobs and decent work shows up in the SDGs. So that's the only thing we've got at the moment countering these other kind of very macro demographic trends, which is a worry, but it's not the only
I asked
one.
the waiter who was taking care of me the other day, I said, well, you don't have to wait anymore. What are you going to do? You don't have to work. They'll all be invited. He said, I'll commit suicide. I'm really worried about what's going to happen socially, culturally, psychologically, theologically to us when we face this. And I don't hear very many people talking about that.
Well, I think
You?
it partly explains the sort of interesting kind of purpose. I think it partly explains why everyone's so focused on romantic love and children. I think it's.
Or is it that's why we have so much about apocalypse movies?
Yeah, but I was a kid in the 80s and there was a lot of nuclear apocalypse stuff at that time as well. So I'm not sure we've got more apocalyptic, but arguably we should have done. We'll see what happens in November. Thanks.
I hope I didn't take up your time too much.
No, of course.
That's an interesting point.
What? Are you reading on UBI? Universal Basic Income?
Yeah, I've heard about it.
Well, I'm saying, well, it's like maybe the next logical steps, so where your question's going.
Yeah, I think that's a very,
Universal, yes, but.
very
How much
interesting.
is big business and government gonna fight that before they really work to make it happen?
There's a lot of
Knowing
research.
human nature,
Yeah.
No, they're forcing
Yeah, I
it
think
to
it's
make
the
it
question,
well.
underlying question maybe we're trying to get at.
Yeah, but the
Apparently
UBI,
supported by
I think
Milton
that's a big
Friedman.
issue.
Who knew? Yeah, universal basic income, very interesting. Interesting that Silicon Valley is so into it.
Mhm.
That's what I'll say
Well,
about
I
that.
loved your accent.
Thanks.
Thank you. Last questions for you?
Anybody?
For coming. Thank you.
Thanks so much.